So here I have the deck I'm going to be playing. It is Blue-Red Goggles, a deck that has really impressed me lately, and it's pretty much come out of nowhere. Todd Anderson played it at an open. It's been seeing a little bit of play recently, but Pyromancer Goggles was not a card on many people's radar. This is not something many players were doing. It's almost similar in many ways to the Blue-Red Tutelage deck that has been seeing some play lately. But let's go ahead and go over some of the cards and what makes this deck so powerful and why the engine works so well. There's a lot of lands in this deck, 26 of them. The blue-red color combination does get Wandering Fumarole. That is one of the better man lands in the format, and having access to a man land is extremely important when you're going two colors. So it gives you something additional to do with your mana, and this deck normally has plenty of lands to work with when all is going well. And there's 3 Drownyard Temples. Some versions play 4. This one has 3, just to try to make the colors requirements that much easier. And Drownyard Temple is very nice alongside Magmatic Insight. Magmatic Insight is one of the reasons why there's so many lands, just because you really want one to be able to discard to Magmatic Insight. And then there's also Tormenting Voice. So these are kind of your draw card enablers. They do a ton for the deck. They help you draw into your late game gas, and they're also some of the best cards you can play alongside Pyromancer Goggles, because now all of a sudden you're drawing twice the cards, essentially, with the Magmatic Insight or Tormenting Voice. Once you're using the mana to cast them, you're using a Goggles for that. So that works out really nicely. It also means that you're constantly having cards to play from your hand, and that helps alongside with your 2-drop creatures. We see Thing in the Ice, which is a new card that it comes into play with 4 counters on it, and then once it flips over, it bounces everything. It becomes a 9/7. It starts getting in for damage. So Thing in the Ice is a very real win condition of the deck. There's only 2 copies, though, because what I found is you don't really want to draw multiples of them. You want to keep your deck very spell dense, and so sometimes you'll draw one later in the game and it won't be super relevant. So I've been pretty happy with 2. I think Jace is a little bit better in terms of 2-drops, but Thing in the Ice still has its moments, especially against archetypes like Ramp, where you really need a legitimate win condition in your deck. And so beyond that, we've got a lot of removal, because there's so many small creature decks like white humans based decks and Bant decks. So we've got 4 copies of Fiery Impulse. This is different from the norm. Most lists don't even play Fiery Impulse, but because we're seeing the uptick in humans, in Bant Company, in decks like that, you really want a 1-mana removal spell for turn 1, and so that's why there's 4 copies of Fiery Impulse in the main deck. And 4 copies of Lightning Axe. Lightning Axe is a very versatile removal spell. You can kill an Archangel of Ties or an Archangel Avacyn with Lightning Axe. And it's also not necessarily a bad thing to be discarding a card. You can discard, for instance, Fiery Temper and madness it out, and that's particularly nice. You can also discard a Drownyard Temple. There's a number of cards you can discard to it. So it's been pretty good, and it's one of the major role players of the deck and one of the better removal spells. Looking at our late game, essentially, there's not that much late game, but the cards that are here do win you the game legitimately. So we've got Jorian, which is a win condition. It can make sure you have a constant stream of cards in your hand, and yes, it does die to opposing removal, but even then you can play Jorian and play an additional spell to at least get that initial card off of it before it potentially dies to removal. We have 1 copy of Pia and Kirinalar as another win condition that's a little bit different from the norm, but it's been quite good in my experience. just making those Thopters, they can do a lot for you. And there's not that much mass removal in the format, so it's pretty hard to answer Pia and Kieran on a one-for-one basis. And then only 2 goggles. Some versions play 3, but 2 has been fine for me. It's been enough because you have so much card draw that normally you find 1, and you actually don't really want multiples, of course, because they're legendary. So it's been fine to play 2. Goggles is one of the centerpiece cards of the deck, but you can certainly win games without it. And so you want to be able to get to that turn 5 when you can play the Goggles, and you need all of your other cards in order to get there, essentially. And there's also 2 Chandra Flamecaller as a way to wrath away smaller creatures, and you can also discard stuff. It works well with Madness, and most of the time you're just playing it, plussing it, making those 3/1 elementals, and putting pressure on your opponent. And at that point in the game, you should be in a very nice spot once Chandra is coming down and your opponent's board isn't too menacing at that point. And the last card that's a bit of a win condition that's also all the way over here is the 2 copies of Fall of the Titans. Fall of the Titans can kill opposing creatures, but it can also go straight to your opponent's face. And with a Pyromancer's Goggles and a 1-mana spell, all of a sudden you're surging Fall of the Titans out and killing your opponent out of nowhere. It's crazy. This card is very good in this deck, and be aware of Fall of the Titans, whether you're playing with this deck or playing against the deck, that's a card that really can be a blowout. So, looking at the sideboard, Fever Visions is a card we've seen come in a number of matchups. Sometimes it's in the main deck, but unfortunately, against some archetypes like Band Company and white aggro decks, Fever Visions is just not that great. It can die to Dramoka's Command, or your opponent can overrun you with white humans before you really get a chance to cast it. So while Fever Visions is great in some matchups, especially on the play, there's other times when it's kind of just vulnerable. It doesn't do that much, so it's a very polarizing Magic card. And some players play it in the main, like I said, but I'm pretty happy just play the 4 on the sideboard. It's normally good enough, essentially. And we've got 2 copies of Kozilek's Return here to sweep away those white humans or the red aggro decks, though those decks aren't particularly popular right now. We've got 2 Eldrazi Obligators, primarily for ramp, to steal a big creature like a Worldbreaker or Dragon Lord Atarka maybe, and get in a bunch of damage. And then we've got 2 copies of Rending Volley. Rending Volley is pretty good right now. It's good against a deck like this blue-red deck. It's good against humans or even Bant Company. So it's a very flexible removal spell, and it's good against a lot of the more heavily played decks at the moment. So I like having 2 in the board. And there's also a suite of counter magic. Negate is actually the best one because of you really want to be boarding in counters against control decks, and at that point all you want is negate. So there's 4 negates and 1 copy of Dispel. So this is the list that I've been working with. I'm actually considering it for the Pro Tour. I think it's quite a powerful deck, and I expect it to continue doing well as Standard progresses.